His ruthless stepmother had picked her from the grimiest tavern in York, an illiterate girl who couldn't even sign her own name, marrying her to Julian Ashworth purely to humiliate him before the entire county. But instead of turning away in disgust, Julian watched his trembling new wife stare at the unreadable marriage lines and quietly decided to teach her the shape of her own name, wondering what secret, beautiful words she might one day write only to him. But what happens when the man who was meant to be broken begins to heal the very woman chosen to destroy him? Stick around for Chapter 1, because the first lesson is about to change everything. Welcome back to the channel, my lovely friends. My granny always says if I can get 1,000 subscribers, she'll finally stop hiding my best stories in her attic and let me share them all with you. So tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from today? Drop a like if you're already hooked, hit subscribe and ring that bell so we can keep bringing these heart-tugging Regency tales straight to you. It really does help us share more stories like this one. Now, let's step into Ashworth Hall. 2 hours after the forced wedding ceremony, the new Mrs. Ashworth stood frozen in her husband's candlelit study, staring down at a marriage contract covered in elegant script that might as well have been ancient runes, for all the meaning she could extract from it. Ilera Finch, Ellie, as she'd been called her entire life, had never imagined she would stand in such a room, surrounded by leather-bound volumes whose gilded spines held secrets forever locked away from her. Her hands, rough and reddened from years of hauling ale and scrubbing tavern floors, looked grotesque against the cream parchment. Fingernails chipped and stained despite her desperate attempts to clean them before the ceremony. Lady Seraphina Montrose's voice drifted clearly from the corridor just beyond the door, where she held court with half a dozen prominent York ladies who had been specially invited to witness the spectacular humiliation. "She is completely illiterate," the Dowager Lady Ashworth announced with vindictive satisfaction, her fan snapping open for emphasis. "Cannot read her own marriage contract, cannot write her own name, cannot even recognize the letters of the alphabet. My stepson defied me once too often, refused every perfectly suitable match I arranged, insisted on making his own choices. So I made this choice for him. And what a choice it is." The assembled ladies gasped and whispered with scandalized delight, their murmurs spreading through Ashworth Hall, like ice creeping across a winter pond. Yet Julian Ashworth, standing rigid at the window with his back to the room, his reflection dark against the rain-streaked glass, found himself wondering something entirely unexpected. As he watched his wife's trembling fingers hover uselessly over the blank space where her signature should be, he thought, what words might she write to him? Once he taught her how? And with those words, spelled out slowly, painstakingly, in her own hand, be the ones he'd been waiting his entire life to receive? He turned from the window, his jaw tight with controlled fury that softened almost imperceptibly as his eyes met hers. "Ellie," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the cruel laughter beyond the door, "would you like to learn to write your name?" And in that single question, everything changed. The alphabet, Ellie discovered, was a beast with 26 heads, each one more slippery than the last. They began the very next morning in Julian's study. The door firmly closed against Lady Seraphina's prying eyes and sharp tongue. Julian had cleared his mahogany desk of everything except 2 sheets of cream paper, a pot of ink, and a single quill. He wrote the letters slowly, methodically, his hand steady and sure, while Ellie perched on the edge of the chair beside him like a bird ready to take flight at the slightest sound. "Hey," he said softly, tracing the shape, like the peak of a roof. She tried to copy it. Her first attempt looked more like a collapsed tent. Her second wasn't much better. By the 10th try, her hand was cramping, ink staining her fingers, frustration burning hot behind her eyes. "I can't," she whispered, voice breaking. "I'm too stupid for this." Julian set down his own quill and turned to face her fully. "You survived years in that tavern," he said quietly. "You remembered hundreds of drink orders without writing a single one down. You kept accounts in your head that would baffle half the gentlemen in this county. You are not stupid, Ellie. You're simply learning something new." Something shifted in her chest at those words. She picked up the quill again. It took 3 weeks before she could write all 26 letters without hesitation. 3 weeks of daily lessons, of ink-stained fingers and paper covered in wobbly lines that gradually, impossibly, began to look like actual words. Julian never raised his voice, never showed impatience, never made her feel small. He simply sat beside her, hour after hour, his presence steady as a lighthouse. The day she wrote her full name for the first time, Illiterate, she stared at it, so long the ink dried glossy and permanent. "That's me," she breathed, touching the letters with a reverent fingertip. "That's my name. I wrote my name." Julian smiled then, a real smile that transformed his usually solemn face into something almost boyish. "Yes," he said, "you did." She wrote it 17 more times that afternoon, each iteration slightly neater than the last, until the page was covered with her own name repeated like a prayer. And Julian watched her with an expression she couldn't quite name, something warm and wondering and almost hungry. That night, alone in his chambers, he found himself unable to stop thinking about the joy that had lit her face, the fierce concentration in her eyes, the small pink tip of her tongue that appeared at the corner of her mouth when she was trying especially hard. A week later, she left a note on his desk. 5 words in careful, painstaking script. "Julian is teaching me kindness." Not Julian is kind. Not Julian teaches me. But Julian is teaching me kindness, as though kindness itself were another alphabet she was learning to read. He stood there holding that scrap of paper for a long time, his throat tight, wondering what sentence she would write next, and whether he was prepared for the way her words were already beginning to reshape everything he thought he knew about his own heart. What happens when she writes her very first sentence, and it's about him? Their lessons began stretching longer, bleeding from morning into afternoon, then into early evening when the light turned honey gold to the study windows. Ellie had a mind like a steel trap, Julian discovered, once she found her own way into the learning. She created memory tricks from her tavern days, associating letters with things she already knew. "B is for barrel," she'd say, tracing the round belly of the letter. "P is for pint glass. See how it has a handle? And D is a pint glass facing the other way." Julian found himself leaning forward to hear these explanations, fascinated by the way her practical mind transformed abstract symbols into concrete objects. She made the alphabet into something alive, something that smelled of ale and would smoke and survival. "How did you remember all those orders?" he asked one afternoon, watching her practice writing simple words. "In the tavern, I mean, without writing anything down." She glanced up, surprised he'd asked. "I gave everyone a story," she said. "The man in the corner with the scar always drank dark ale because his heart was dark too. The woman with the yellow shawl wanted gin because she was trying to forget something golden she'd lost. Stories stick better than names." "That's rather brilliant," Julian said quietly. She ducked her head, but he saw the flush of pleasure on her cheeks. The conversations grew longer, more personal. One gray afternoon, when the rain drummed against the windows, Ellie's quill stilled over the page. "Did you have a mother?" she asked, then immediately tensed as if expecting to be struck for the impertinence. Julian was quiet for a long moment. "I did," he finally said. "She died when I was 8. My father remarried quickly. Lady Seraphina made it clear from the first day that I was an inconvenience, an obstacle to her own comfort. I never knew mine," Ellie said softly. "They told me she left me on the tavern step, wrapped in a flour sack. I used to pretend she was a fine lady who'd had no choice, who thought of me every day and regretted leaving me. Stupid, really." "No," Julian said firmly, and his hand moved without thinking, covering hers where it rested on the desk. "Not stupid. Necessary." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Recognition of the same hollow ache, the same childhood spent hungry for a love that never came. Ellie's fingers turned beneath his palm, threading through his just slightly, just for a heartbeat, before she pulled away and returned to her letters with flushed cheeks and trembling hands. That night, Julian sat alone in the dark study long after she'd gone, touching the spot on the desk where their hands had met, feeling the ghost of her pulse against his. And Ellie lay awake in her grand, cold bedroom, wondering what words she would write to him when she finally learned to write a proper letter, wondering if she dared to tell him that the loneliest she'd ever felt was in that tavern surrounded by people, and the least lonely was here in this silent house, sitting beside him while the afternoon light faded, and the only sound was a scratch of quill on paper. What secret message would she leave for him when she finally learns how to write a proper letter? Julian returned to the study after a particularly brutal breakfast with Lady Seraphina, an hour of thinly veiled insults about his charitable work with his illiterate wife, to find Ellie already at the desk, bent over a page with fierce concentration. He approached quietly, not wanting to disturb her, and stopped short when he saw what she'd written. Julian is kind, not once, not twice, but over and over again, filling the entire page in increasingly confident script. Julian is kind. Julian is kind. Julian is kind. The words marched down the paper like a prayer, like a declaration, like something she needed to say so desperately she'd said it 27 times. She must have heard him coming, must have felt his presence behind her, because her hands stilled and her shoulders tensed. "I wasn't supposed to write anything without you," she said quietly, not turning around. "But I woke up thinking it, and I needed to see if I could make the words real, if I could make them true by writing them down." Julian's throat closed. His carefully constructed walls, built over years of his stepmother's cruelty and his father's indifference, cracked wide open. He'd been called many things in his life: dutiful, proper, cold, proud. But kind? No one had ever looked at him and seen kindness. "Ellie," he managed, his voice rough. She turned then, and her eyes were bright with something fierce and honest. "It's true, though, isn't it? You are kind, even when no one's watching, even when there's nothing to gain from it. You've been kind to me when the whole world thinks I'm not worth the dirt on your boots." He moved around the desk without thinking, knelt beside her chair so they were eye to level, and took both her ink-stained hands in his. "You are worth everything," he said, each word deliberate and true. "Do you hear me, Ellie? Everything." She stared at him, breathing hard, and he watched a single tear slip down her cheek before she quickly brushed it away. "I'll write it better next time," she whispered. "I'll learn to write it perfectly." "It's already perfect," he said. That night, he carefully cut that page from her practice book and folded it into his breast pocket, carrying it against his heart. And when he finally undressed for bed hours later, he unfolded it one more time, running his fingers over the words until his vision blurred. "Julian is kind. Julian is kind. Julian is kind." No one had ever given him a gift more precious. Now listen, my lovely friends, if stories like this ever made your heart race even a little, if Julian and Ellie's slow burn love is making you feel things you haven't felt in ages, don't let this one disappear from your feed. Hit subscribe right now so you never miss the next chapter. Those who skip it, well, you'll have to tell us in the comments why you're willing to walk away from a love this beautiful. Because what comes next, it's going to break your heart in the best way. What happens when she begins hiding those letters where only he will find them? Julian decided it was time to teach her how to write a proper letter. Not just words, he explained, pulling out fresh paper, but correspondence, a way to speak to someone when you cannot use your voice. Ellie's eyes lit up with understanding, like a conversation on paper. Exactly like that. They practiced the structure, greetings, body, closings. But somewhere between the formal lessons and the quiet intimacy of the study, something shifted. Ellie began leaving notes. The first one appeared tucked inside the book Julian had been reading, a slim volume of poetry he'd left on the side table. 3 simple lines in her careful script. "Did you choose this book because you were sad? The man in the tavern who read poetry was always the saddest. I hope you're not sad today." Julian stood in his study holding that scrap of paper, his heart doing something complicated in his chest. He pulled out his own pen and wrote beneath her words, I am not sad today. How could I be when you notice such things about me? He left it on her desk in the morning room. By evening, she'd replied on the same paper. I notice everything about you. The notes multiplied like wildflowers after rain. Julian found one tucked under his pillow. You smiled at breakfast when Lady Seraphina was not looking. I wish you would smile more. Another appeared in the library, slipped between the pages of an atlas. Have you been to all these places? Or do you dream of going? He answered every single one, his responses growing longer, more honest. I have been nowhere that mattered. But if you wanted to see the sea, I would take you tomorrow. She wrote back, I would like to see something that goes on forever. The tavern walls were so close, I thought the world ended just beyond the door. They were writing to each other multiple times a day now. These secret conversations that existed only on paper, too precious and private to speak aloud. Ellie observed him with an intensity that should have felt intrusive, but instead felt like being truly seen for the first time in his life. She noticed when he was tired, when something had angered him, when he'd skipped lunch because he was lost in estate paperwork. You work too hard, she wrote. Even your shoulders look sad. Your handwriting is getting beautiful, he replied. I find myself waiting for your letters like other men wait for sunrise. One evening, he found a note on his desk that made him sit down heavily in his chair. I think I am beginning to understand why people write love poetry. Some feelings are too big for speaking. They need the slowness of ink. His hand trembled as he wrote his response. Yes, some feelings need the safety of paper first, before we are brave enough to say them out loud. He left it for her, his heart pounding, wondering if she understood what he was really confessing. Wondering if she felt it too, this thing growing between them that was too enormous and terrifying to name. But there was something else in her recent letters, something shadow-edged that she danced around but never quite touched. A hesitation, a shame. What devastating truth about her past will Ellie finally dare to confess in ink? The letter appeared on his desk one morning. Longer than any she'd written before. The words cramped and urgent as though they'd been racing to escape her pen. Julian, I need to tell you something true. I was hungry for so long I forgot what it felt like not to be. Not just stomach-empty hungry, but hungry in my bones, in my sleep, in every thought. I stole food when I could. I ate scraps from plates before I washed them. There were nights I let men touch my hand or my hair for an extra coin, and I am not proud of it, but I would have done worse if I had needed to. I thought I would die in that tavern, just another girl nobody remembered or mourned. You need to know what you married. You need to know I am not ashamed of surviving, but I am ashamed that surviving made me into something your world will never accept. I understand if you cannot look at me the same way now. Julian read it 3 times, his vision blurring, his chest so tight he could barely breathe. He picked up his pen, and the words poured out of him like a confession. Ellie, I have stood in ballrooms full of people who admired me and felt like I was drowning. I have everything a man could want, title, wealth, this grand house, and I have felt nothing, nothing. For years I moved through my life like a ghost, performing the role of dutiful son and respectable gentleman, while feeling hollow inside. My father loved Seraphina more than he ever loved me, and when he died, he left me to her mercy. She has controlled every aspect of my existence, and I let her because I did not think I deserved better. I thought this emptiness was all I would ever know. Then you came, and suddenly I am awake. You make me feel real. You, who survived, held your courage intact, who notices when my shoulders are sad, who writes to me about feelings too big for speaking. You are the bravest person I have ever known. I do not care what you had to do to survive. I care that you did survive, that you are here, that you write to me. She found his letter and wept over it, her tears blotting the ink. Her response was short. I think I am falling in love with you on paper first. His reply made her hands shake. I have already fallen. Completely, irrevocably, on paper and everywhere else. After that, their letters became love letters in truth. pages filled with observations and longings, confessions and promises. She wrote about wanting to kiss him. He wrote about lying awake, imagining holding her. They were courting each other in secret, in ink, building something precious and private that belonged only to them. Julian began carrying her letters in his breast pocket, all of them, the stack growing thicker each day. Ellie kept his in a wooden box under her bed, tied with ribbon, reading them over and over until she knew them by heart. For 2 perfect months, they lived in their paper world, writing truths they were still too afraid to speak aloud, falling deeper in love with every page. Neither of them noticed Lady Seraphina, watching, waiting, following the trail of hidden notes like a hunter tracking prey. What happens when Lady Seraphina discovers the one thing that can shatter them both? Lady Seraphina chose a monthly family dinner to strike, when the dining room was filled with distant cousins, local gentry, and influential York families who'd come to observe the scandalous marriage. They were halfway through the second course when she rose from her seat, a stack of familiar papers in her hand. Ellie's stomach dropped. She recognized the cream stationery, the careful handwriting, the ribbon that had bound them. "I feel it is my duty," Lady Seraphina announced, her voice carrying over the sudden silence, "to share something I discovered while ensuring the household accounts were in order. It seems my stepson and his wife have been exchanging correspondence." She held up the letters like evidence at a trial. Julian went rigid beside Ellie, his fork clattering to his plate. "Shall I read some highlights?" Seraphina's smile was venomous. "Here is one. I think I am falling in love with you on paper first." How charming. How quaint. The tavern girl fancies herself capable of sophisticated emotion. Cruel laughter rippled through the room. Ellie felt her face burning, felt every eye on her like a brand. Lady Seraphina continued, her voice dripping with mockery. "I was hungry for so long I forgot what it felt like not to be. I let men touch my hand or my hair for an extra coin." She paused for effect. "Well, I suppose we all suspected what sort of establishment she truly worked in, didn't we?" And here she admits it in her own barely legible hand. The room erupted in scandalized whispers. Ellie couldn't breathe, couldn't move, could only sit frozen as her most private confessions, her most vulnerable words, were twisted into weapons and used to eviscerate her in front of everyone who mattered in Julian's world. Then Julian stood. The scrape of his chair was deafening. Every eye turned to him. "That is enough." His voice was quiet, deadly calm, and somehow more terrifying than any shout. "You will return those letters immediately, and then you will leave this house. Tonight, forever." Lady Seraphina laughed. "Don't be absurd. I am You are nothing to me." Julian cut her off, his words sharp as blades. "You were never a mother. You were a tyrant who made my childhood a misery and my father's final year's performance of duty over love. And now you have violated the privacy of my wife, who has more courage in her smallest finger than you possessed in your entire spiteful existence." He turned to face the room, his hand finding Ellie's and gripping it tight. "My wife survived horrors none of you could imagine. She learned to read and write in mere months, mastering skills you take for granted. She writes with more honesty and heart than any of your polished society letters could ever contain. And yes, she is falling in love with me and I with her, and that is no one's business but ours." He looked back at Lady Seraphina, his eyes blazing. "You have 1 hour to pack your belongings. If you are still on my property by sunrise, I will have you forcibly removed. Do I make myself clear?" Lady Seraphina's face contorted with rage and humiliation. She threw the letters at his feet and swept from the room, her skirts snapping like a whip. The dinner guests sat in stunned silence. Julian bent and gathered every letter, his hands gentle, then helped Ellie to her feet. They walked out together, his arm around her shaking shoulders, leaving the gaping crowd behind. But what vicious revenge will Seraphina unleash now that she has nothing left to lose? Lady Seraphina's revenge came swiftly and viciously, like poison in the bloodstream. Within 3 days, Documents began circulating through York society. Papers bearing official-looking seals, testimonies from supposed witnesses, detailed accounts of Ellie's years at the tavern. They claimed she hadn't just served ale. They described her in explicit, degrading terms, painting her as a common prostitute who'd worked the upstairs rooms, who'd entertained dozens of men, who'd been bought by Julian's stepmother specifically because her reputation was so thoroughly ruined that even marriage to a gentleman couldn't salvage it. The papers were forgeries, every single one, but they looked authentic. And society, ever hungry for scandal, devoured them. The invitations stopped coming. Former friends crossed the street to avoid Julian. Whispers followed Ellie everywhere, to the village, to church, even within Ashworth Hall itself, where certain servants began looking at her with disgust or pity. Julian fought back with everything he had. He hired investigators, threatened legal action, publicly denounced the documents as fabrications. But the damage was done. The lie had taken root and was spreading like rot through wood. Ellie watched him destroy himself trying to defend her, watched the lines deepen around his eyes, the tension settle into his shoulders, watched him argue with solicitors late into the night, saw his hands shake with exhaustion and fury. She couldn't bear it anymore. On the 7th night, after he'd finally fallen asleep in his study, papers scattered around him like the wreckage of a losing battle. Ellie sat at her desk and wrote one final letter. My dearest Julian, by the time you read this, I will be gone. Please do not search for me. You have given me the most precious gift anyone has ever given me. You taught me that I was worthy of love, of patience, of kindness. You made me believe I was more than what the world said I was. But I cannot watch you sacrifice everything for me. Your reputation, your standing, your peace. They are being destroyed because of what I am, what I was, what they will always believe I am. Lady Seraphina was right about one thing. I do not belong in your world. I never did. I was foolish to think love could bridge that gap. You deserve a wife who elevates you, not one who drags you into scandal and ruin. You deserve to be happy without fighting every single day just to justify my existence beside you. I love you too much to stay. Please forgive me. Please forget me. Please live the life you were meant to have before your stepmother used me as a weapon against you. You were always kind to me. I will remember that forever. Yours always, Ellie. She folded the letter, left it on his pillow, and packed her single small bag with the few possessions she'd brought from her old life. She would leave at dawn, slip out before the household woke, disappear back into the world she'd come from. She'd save him once by marrying him. Now she'd save him by leaving. Ellie sat by the window in the darkness, watching the skies slowly lighten, waiting for the moment when she could vanish from Julian's life forever. She didn't hear his footsteps in the hall, didn't hear him open her door, didn't realize he'd found her letter until his voice, raw and desperate, shattered the silence. Ellie, no. Will Julian reach her in time, or will the woman he loves vanish to save him? Julian crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled the letter from her hands, his eyes scanning the words with growing desperation. No, he said again, his voice breaking. Ellie, no. You don't get to decide this alone. You don't get to sacrifice yourself to save me when I don't want to be saved. I want you, only you, always you. Julian, your reputation. Damn my reputation, he said fiercely, dropping to his knees before a chair, taking both her hands in his. Damn society. Damn every single person who believes those lies. I would rather be ruined with you than respectable without you. Do you understand me? I love you, not on paper anymore, not in secret. I love you, Ellie, and I will shout it from every rooftop in York if that's what it takes to make you stay. Tears streamed down her face. I'm destroying you. You're saving me, he whispered. You have been saving me from the moment you first wrote my name. Please, Ellie, please don't go. Let me fight for us. Let me fight for you. She saw the truth in his eyes, the raw desperation, the absolute certainty, and she stayed. That evening, Julian took her to the season's most prestigious assembly ball at the York Assembly Rooms. Every head turned when they entered. The whispers started immediately. Julian didn't care. He'd brought documents of his own, official testimonies from the tavern owner, employment records, statements from York magistrates confirming the forgeries bore his stepmother's handwriting. He'd spent the past 3 days gathering irrefutable proof. In the center of the ballroom, before everyone who mattered in York society, he exposed Lady Seraphina's vicious scheme, showed the forged seals, the fabricated witness statements, the cruel fabrication of lies designed to destroy an innocent woman. "My wife," he said, his voice carrying over the shocked silence, "survived poverty and hunger with more grace than most of you have shown with every advantage. She learned to read in months. She writes with more honesty than any of your carefully practiced correspondence. And she loved me when I had forgotten how to love myself. If you cannot accept her, then you cannot accept me. And frankly, I find I no longer care for the acceptance of people who would believe such vicious lies without question." The tide turned slowly, then all at once. Faces that had been cold became thoughtful, then ashamed. Whispered apologies began. Invitations were extended. Lady Seraphina, already ostracized for her public humiliation at dinner, became completely untouchable. In the carriage on the way home, Julian pulled Ellie close and whispered against her hair. "I love you. I love you," she whispered back, the words finally spoken aloud, no longer needing the safety of paper. 6 months later, Ellie stood in the converted morning room of Ashworth Hall, watching 15 mill workers' children practice writing their names. Her small literacy school had become the talk of York, but this time the talk was admiring. Her hand rested on the gentle swell of her belly, where their first child grew. Julian appeared in the doorway, and she caught his eye. He smiled, then held up a small folded note, the gesture they'd never stopped. Still writing to each other, still leaving letters in books and under pillows, still falling in love on paper, even though they said aloud every single day. She touched her heart, then pointed to him. He did the same. Some loves, they'd learned, were too big for one language alone. They needed words spoken and words written, touches and glances, public declarations and private notes that said simply, "You are everything. You are home. You are mine." Now listen, my lovely friends, if Julian and Ellie's happy ending moved you even a fraction, if their journey from shame to love made your heart swell, imagine missing the next couple who deserve their miracle. Subscribe now. Don't make me read in the comments that you let this love story slip away because you didn't hit the button. We need you here for the next one, because there are so many more love stories waiting to be told, and I want to share every single one with you. Until next time, remember, sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the cruelest intentions and end with the most beautiful words.